Welcome to our broadcast. John le Carré began writing espionage fiction in the early 1960s while serving as a diplomat in the British Foreign Service. It was his third novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Coal, that gained him international acclaim. Each succeeding work, including The Looking-Glass War and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, confirmed him a master of chronicling the cruel and cunning underworld of the Cold War. In The Secret Pilgrim, le Carré turned to the future of espionage in the New World Order. The adventure continues in his latest novel, The Night Manager, and we are very pleased to have him here. Welcome. You are, I mean, everybody knows you're David Cornwell,
yeah.
and you chose the name John le Carré, which in French means what, the house?
The square.
The square.
Yeah, and a lot of other things. I mean, if you have a carré at roulette, I think it is, you have a coin on each corner.
Yes. This is a departure, and well, there are questions of spies and a lot of other, and competition within spies, but it is a post-Cold War book.
Yeah.
You were happy to see the end of the Cold War, even as a writer, because some people said, gee, it's going to be a tough time for people who write about the lives of espionage and the world of spying, but you were happy to see the Cold War end.
Well, I was delighted to see the Cold War end. I couldn't wait for it to end, either as an ordinary human being or as a writer. At the time when people said I would have nothing more to write about, that was the sweet time, immediately after the Cold War, when people thought we'd have a better, safer world where spies wouldn't be necessary. I'm afraid I never shared that view. So, yes, it's a new departure, as you say, but the departure was really made by the world, not by me. And I've tried to address the phenomenon of who we are and what priorities we have and what we shall be targeting politically, how we shall deploy our spies in the future. But most particularly, I've taken this period of indirection, as I see it, this leaderless period of confusion immediately after the Cold War, and examined it, I'm afraid, with some despair.
Despair?
Yes, to portray a group of people who are still looking for their identity, and an intelligence service, which is my metaphor for civilization, if you will, for social man, which has also lost its way for want of direction and has become corrupt and conspiratorial and is suffering from corporate rot.
Yeah. Where did the idea come from?
The idea of using arms dealers and drugs and stuff, I suppose, came as much from the newspapers and reading about modern scandal and modern fraud and the state of, if you will, public morality in public places suggested to me that a tale of corruption was appropriate to our time. And then, of course, when I was in the secret world, arms dealers were to some extent the creatures of the intelligence services. If you supply arms to a country, you have an in there and you exercise power. Intelligence services were often used to spirit arms to a place that theoretically should not be armed. In fact, intelligence services were used to defy overt government policy. And it was that kind of cocktail that I shook and made a story of.
And the character, Jonathan Pine?
Well, all characters are, to some extent, amalgams of people you meet, people you observe, gestures you like, features you like, and then when you start putting them all together, you begin to breathe into them your own life. You can't help it. So I think that most central characters, most three-dimensional characters, are to some extent examinations of the possibilities of one's own character.
The possibilities of one's own
yeah,
character.
Who would I become? I had this background, but supposing Cleopatra's nose had been a little longer or shorter, would I have become a different person if I'd received the wrong advice, if I'd if I'd responded differently to certain events, who would I have become? I think you use, as I say, the possibilities of your own character to invent new forms that you can understand. They remain within your reach if you feel, well, if I were very bad, I would do that. And sometimes I have been very bad and nearly done it. And so much of it, much of character making is this dangerous journey of introspection, I think.
Yeah. You have always, even in the spy novels, been more fascinated by the lives of the characters than the ideological conflict that existed.
Well, the two things went together in the sense that we fight the wars we inherit. We respond to duty. We are creatures of our background and environment. And we are very quickly made in life. The first few years seem to be determining who we are for years and years afterwards. You know, I'm past 60 now. I find that I spend more time thinking about my childhood than I ever did.
Why is that?
I think that you look for explanations to yourself and you simply go further and further back and you wonder whether you ever changed or ever developed.
But stay with that idea. Your conclusion is that you were so formed as a child that essentially it was set in motion who you were? Yes,
I think my conclusion is, speaking as a writer now, that the larcenous childhood I had, I was brought up by an extremely adventurous financier who went to jail a few times and so on. I was brought up largely without a mother, but
your mother left home when you
were
about
very
5.
Small. Yeah, and those things happen to anybody. But what was exotic about my childhood was that I slipstreamed behind this Micawber-like figure.
Your father?
My father, and that he wanted terribly that I should become something smooth and elegant and very British and beautiful and very classy. And
all things that he aspired to?
Yes, all the things that he aspired to, and he came from a humble background and wanted me to redress what he saw as the deficiencies in his own childhood. And to a great extent, I found myself acting out his fantasies for him and pretending for him, accommodating him. And so I think that at a very early age, I became something of a spy. And I also sought in corporate attachment some kind of family life which eluded me in my home, so that it was natural as I grew up as a young, rather idealistic man, that I saw in institutions something I hadn't had in childhood. And that is very much here in this book, in the central character.
What was it you found in institutions?
I wanted to find truth, a larger truth than was in us individually. I wanted to find the secret center, if you like, of what made society work, who we were, how we behaved. I thought I could find in our corporate identity perhaps some explanation to my individual nature. I also wanted, because I felt very torn and peculiar as a young man, I wanted to sublimate myself in something that I thought was socially useful. And I also took refuge in secrecy. People who work in secret departments are not at risk. They're very much protected by that environment. And secrecy is some kind of embracing and secure-making environment that the unanchored people seek out and take pleasure in. It's a complete misperception to imagine that if you're in an intelligence service, you're exposed to life in a way which people in the overt world are not. It's quite the reverse. Very few intelligence people are streetwise. They tend to be very protected.
Yeah. Some have said that many of the characters and many of the values that you have drawn of the people in that world is cynical.
Well, that's nonsense. I mean, I may be cynical in the sense that I'm a disenchanted romantic.
A disenchanted romantic.
Yes. But I have a great ambition for human goodness, and I believe it can be obtained through corporate activity. I think that great leadership can produce a better world. I don't think that we are constantly tied to the worst side of our corporate nature.
And there's so much you leave me to talk about, but in fact, you now believe after the Cold War, going away from that the United States needs to play a significant new role.
Oh, I'm quite sure it does, yes.
And has to take risk and has to engage at a time when no one else is prepared to do it and no one else is willing to incur the obligation.
Yes, I mean, I think it's going to be a great period for the United States when it does discover that altruistic war, alas, is going to be part of its future destiny. I mean, you are the only superpower we have left, and that may be tough, but it's not as tough as when there were two.
Yes.
And I don't think that that isolationist or parochial perceptions of the world's future are tenable anymore. We know it's a global village. Even the European concept is too limited. And the fact that Europe is in total chaos at the moment, that we haven't a single leader worth a damn in Europe, actually leaves you, I'm afraid, with a heavier burden. I believe that in the end, the United Nations will have to be in some form militarized in a controlled way. I think we'll have to raise a volunteer army, put it at the disposal of the International Volunteer Army. I think that we'll have to put that at the disposal of the Security Council and produce an internal semi-military council, which is prepared to intervene very fast in the trouble spots as they appear, and where acts of tyranny or genocide are being visibly contemplated before our very eyes, we go in at once and we separate the belligerents and we say, now stop. There is no bloodshed. There will be no bloodshed until we negotiate this through. And we'll lose life. You know, there will be a loss of life. But you have to remember the United Nations at the moment is engaged in 14 different wars. And I think with a staff of about 35 people to administer them, literally. I think that it is possible to stop this rot of brushfire wars. I think it is possible to organize the world with muscle and abandon this notion that war is inevitable, that human suffering is eternal, that famine, drought...
And also the prevailing notion is nobody can be the world's policeman right now.
Yeah, I think that's nonsense. I think we've got to be. I think we've got to grow into our destiny. The West has, or the civilized nations have, and a new kind, it's a totally unfashionable perception, but a new kind of altruistic colonialism has to be exercised, in my view, by the powerful and sophisticated nations.
But make sure you define it as an altruistic colonialism,
yes,
and not a throwback to another kind of colonialism.
That's right. With all kinds of checks and balances to make sure that national interest is not being served under the cloak of international intervention.
Let me go back to you and growing up. Your mother walked away.
She disappeared.
Just disappeared.
As mothers do. Yeah.
But you went to see her later. You found her.
Yeah, that was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. It's one of those really odd moments in one's life. It had never been a good subject, where she had gone, and I have no memory of being particularly at a loss about her. I don't remember missing her at all. Whether I put that out of my memory or not, I don't know. But as I approached the mythic age of 21, I thought I would try and find out where she was, whether she was alive, and I wrote to her brother, who gave me her address. So I wrote to the address. She was living under another name with a guy. And she said, meet me at Ipswich railway station, little town, 100 miles from London. And so I got on a train, and there were 3 eligible mothers at the barrier. And then I recognized one of them suddenly. It looked like my elder brother in a white wig, and she came forward with her arms out. And you had a funny feeling of, what do you do with a mother? Do you hug her? Do you... it was most odd. And then... and she told me, she filled in a whole lot of gaps and mysteries about my life.
What did it do for you? What was the benefit of it?
I don't know that there was much benefit. Later, when she became much older, I had some sense of self-completion. But I think whatever solitude the whole experience had implanted in me remained. What I didn't feel was some sudden surge of filial affection. It was.
Now, did you have a brother who'd also found her?
Yes, that was even more bizarre.
And she didn't tell you that she had seen her brother?
No, nor did my brother tell me that he'd seen her. And he was 2 years older, and it was only much, much later when we compared notes that we discovered that we had both gone the same route. We'd both written to her brother. Yeah. We had both received the address, and I didn't tell him for years. Where this, we would call it in the Secret Service, compartmentation. Where this compartmentation came from, I don't know, but it suggests to me that we were extremely wary people.
Yeah. When you wrote The Perfect Spy, did it free you in any way about your relationship with your father?
Yes. I mean, if you have that kind of father, it's a kind of, I don't know, it's impossible to describe in a sense. He was totally embracing. He had to do the duty of both parents. He was very chaotic and very truthless, absolutely truthless.
Could not tell the truth,
or
did not know the truth.
Couldn't address either. It, didn't care about it. He should have been a writer. I mean, he was every experience that he enjoyed or suffered immediately had its fictional form. And I tried for a long time to write about him. I thought he was by far the most important thing that had ever happened to me in a way. And every time I wrote, tried to approach in fiction, in non-fiction, it was whingy and self-pitying. And then in A Perfect Spy, I hit upon the device of making the son the inheritor of the father's deceit.
Yes.
And actually more deceitful, perhaps more wicked than the father. And at that moment, the book took off for me, and I was able to address it and write about my father in a freer way. And when it was over, in answer to your question, I'm afraid a long answer, but there it is. When it was over, I felt an altered person. I felt as if I'd taken myself through some kind of wonderful, refreshing therapy. Yeah. I've never been to a shrink. I mean, I don't think I'd ever get away if I went.
You mean you have so much you want to talk about? But I get a sense that right now, I mean, not at this moment, but that in what I read about you, there is underway with you a fascinating kind of revelation and introspection. You mentioned looking back at your childhood, and almost an eagerness to talk about it, to share it in a sense. Are you at a certain point in your life that?
Well, I feel freer. I'm who I am, and when I was young, under the influence of this absolutely anarchic experience, I became very orthodox in my attachments. You know, I wanted to make a very orthodox marriage. I wanted to have orthodox children, and I taught at Eton for a few years, and then I looked like a civil servant, and that suited me very well. And then the secret side of my life kind of served to scratch what other itches I had. And then, as I've grown older, I've become less formal, less conventional, more anarchic, I think, in my approach to life. I just feel much freer,
and that
much
makes you feel better about yourself because of all that.
I feel better about myself. I'm naughtier.
Were you ever? You've generally been described as a low-level agent, spy. How would you characterize your own espionage experience?
Well, I was caught up in it very, very young, and so I had several years of being what you would call a field agent. That was working for somebody in the field, and I can't describe what I did, except it was pretty yucky, but it felt like doing something terribly important in a very important cause. I mean, the perception among students in those days, or the perception of students, was that they were likely to be talent spotted and recruited by the KGB, for instance. And therefore, some students were put through a kind of sheep dip to see if the KGB approached them. They were dressed up to look attractive and that stuff. But it was all terribly low level. And then I tried to escape the secret world and went into teaching for a while, and then it drew me back.
This was at Eton?
Yeah, this was at Eton, and then in one way or another it drew me back, and it fascinated me.
It drew you back, meaning the passion for the secret world.
Yeah, the interest in it, the attraction to it, it appealed to very much to a part of my nature. The imaginative, the constructive, the creative side was quite often spoken to in in the invention of operations. You sit around a table, you're an ideas man, it's that stuff. Yeah. And I was drawn to it, and I had a great sense of service. I wanted to serve my country. We believed in that stuff, and the Cold War was a real and awful experience for our civilization, and I wanted to contribute to our side of it. I thought communism had to be addressed and fought.
And spying was a metaphor for what?
It was a metaphor for the whole thing, as it turned out. I mean, people say it's genre fiction, yeah. but spying was the genre of the Cold War. It was the way we assembled our counter-subversive activity. It was the way we responded to a revolutionary movement which saw subversion, assassination, infiltration, and espionage as its natural weapons. We had to do something about that. And we responded probably in many very mawkish ways, but we had to block it. We had to counter it. I don't see how we could have done otherwise. In doing that, we raised very serious questions about ourselves. We had to ask ourselves, what can you do in the name of democracy and remain a democracy that's worth defending? We tested the limits, I think, of our democratic consciences, and very often we transgressed them, our democratic consciences. Yes. Very often we did things that were a kind of, hence the title, The Looking Glass War, a kind of mirror image of what the other guys were doing. And we didn't look good to ourselves doing that. We also created, in the course of the Cold War, through our secret departments, a kind of unelected and very unattractive hierarchy of secret power. And secrecy in your administration and in mine became money. It became a source of power in itself. If you're not allowed to know what I am allowed to know, I'm a better guy than you are. Yeah. And if I want to keep you in your place, I'm not going to tell you. And if I think you ought to be taken down a peg, I may wonder about your loyalty. And so we took ourselves into a dirty frame of mind. And I begin to wonder now, going back to the night manager for a sec, I mean, I wonder what kind of perestroika we have to undertake psychologically in ourselves, what kind of refurbishing of our political consciences is necessary after the Cold War experience. I think we're in a kind of moral doldrum because the anti-communist crusade has been taken away from us. And that's left us unattractive. You know, we in the 80s, we put up materialism as a kind of replacement for morality.
Right.
And now we're not materialistic either, but we're still not moral.
Now, somebody said something about it. I mean, they said that now that the Cold War's gone and communism, you know, now the question is, what about capitalism?
Well, that's right.
And what about the deeds of capitalism?
Yeah, that's right. And what we have to take, I mean...
And what has capitalism sown, and how do you examine that?
Yes.
You know, and find some judgment for that.
What are the limits? I mean, to what extent can you preach expansion in the global village? You know, the doctrine of capitalism is the doctrine of limitless expansion, but it is ecologically unsound, and we have vastly over-industrialized areas and vastly under-industrialized areas. We have, I suppose, to reconsider the distribution of the world's wealth and things like this. These are not nearly such sexy problems as fighting communism.
Yeah. Let me just go back to The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. That was written, it has been said, sort of out of a real rage on your part.
Yes.
Was it?
So, yes, it was. I went up to
you
Berlin.
had served
just
in
after,
Berlin.
Yeah, I had a professional interest in Berlin, and when
that's a nice way of saying it. I had a professional interest.
When the wall
I'd
went
gone
up,
there on business.
That's right. And when the wall went up, I was soon afterwards. I was back in Berlin from Bonn, and I spent some days really watching the construction of the wall. Those were very early days. The wall just didn't come up like a mushroom. First of all, they threw barbed wire entanglements across. And when I first saw Checkpoint Charlie, the Soviet and American tanks were facing each other and revving their engines at each other and waving their guns at each other all through the night. And this sort of impotent snarling at each other seemed to be symbolic. And but I hardly slept for 3 nights and 3 days, and I was looking for a book, and I was really appalled by, first of all, the shock of the war. I mean, we had no, as far as I know, we had no forewarning. Incredible lack of intelligence for us intelligencers. Yes. What a catastrophe. The agents who were locked in, most of them had no contingency plans, no fallback. They didn't know what to do. They hadn't got buried radios or whatever they needed. They hadn't got their gold bars. They hadn't got any damn thing. I mean, it was, nobody seemed to have been warned of anything. And then my feeling was very much that if we had simply gone across at that point, which we were allowed to do under the four-power status, if we had not hesitated, if we hadn't stood at the brink and conferred,
he who hesitates is lost.
He who hesitates at that moment is lost.
Yeah.
And then I just couldn't sleep. I mean, you get periods in your life of such wonderful hyperactivity, of amazing mental clarity, I think, just occasionally. You know, I was 29, 30 or something, and I went back to Bonn, and over 4 or 5 weeks, I just wrote in any spare hour. I'd get up at 3 in the morning, work for 3 hours, and I wrote an enormous book, mainly in longhand, of about, it would have been 150,000 words. And I didn't look back. I mean, normally I look back and fiddle and mess around and take bits out and put them forward and take forward bits and put them back. But this time I just went straight through, and then I cut it right down, right down, and right down. And I knew I'd got something pretty good. And I knew I'd said something very angry. This notion that really, literally in the rubble of the 39-45 war, we had set up these inhuman ramparts somehow of ideological imbecility. I also had a very strong feeling that we were posturing so much in our ideologies that there was a much closer mutual recognition at the human level than was ever expressed in the ideological face-off. And somehow all that stuff, you know, it happens to you maybe just once in a lifetime. Yeah. All that stuff came together, and I found the right metaphor, the right parable.
And how did it change your life, the success of that?
No, I went crazy for a while. I mean,
what does that mean?
Well, it means money and power,
right.
and also, is it me? And Christ, if this is success, you know, what's the rest of the world like? I didn't deserve this. This is absurd. And I don't like. I'm not a media man, and I mean, I have a lot of vanities. It's not but they don't take that form. And I was scared stiff. I remember
scared of
of success and of the future. You know, how do you fill in the next ticket? I'd no particular plans for another book. It had been my idea to turn out one little book a year, maybe, and supplement my Foreign Office salary. My employers, neither my employers nor I had dreamed that this would happen, and they had cleared my books. You know, I remember Life magazine came out in those days. It was a huge affair. Life magazine arrived, and the photographer, Rudy Crane, his name was. He was a first-generation American, originally of German stock or German Jewish blood, and he took me down to Hamburg docks. He wanted the 9,000th photograph of those 3 days had got to be in the docks, and he's this great big liner dressed overall as a fairy lit, and he said, "Okay, now get up there. That's great." And they had lights, and 4 or 5 guys and a girl with a pad writing down it. And all of a sudden, as he saw that, the ship began moving out of Hamburg docks, and he moved down right to the end of the pier and shouted, "Halt! Stop!" And the boat, believe it or not, came to a halt. And a voice came back over the water, "Was ist? What do you want?"
Yes.
And he said, "Wir sind von Life magazine. Wir machen Aufnahmen. We're making photographs. We're Life magazine." And there was a long silence, and the voice came back in German, "Well, hurry up." and I thought, "Oh, that's wonderful." I stopped a liner in Hamburg Harbor. And
so
it
you
was
knew
amazing.
you had power.
Yeah, I knew I had power, and it all scared me, and I knew it was all ephemeral, and I just wanted to get my head straight and myself straight and my life straight, and discover what it was like to be rich. I'd never had money before, let alone I'd never been noticed before. And I took my family off to Crete, the island of Crete, which was then completely undeveloped. We lived there for a year, and then I went to Vienna for a year.
You lived in von Karajan's castle?
Von Karajan's house, yes. I rented von Karajan's apartment, and that was absolutely wonderful. I mean, he'd left it a month before, and all the servants knew that when Carré came back from a concert, he did not expect to open his own doors. So the first few nights when we came home in the evening, we were doing the cinema or something, all the doors opened like this. And then it was most odd. And there were 2 apartments, just duplicated, and the Carré slept upstairs and the children slept downstairs, and you had to kind of pinch yourself to find out which apartment you were on. Everything was duplicated. It's too weird.
When you wrote the Smiley trilogy, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, obviously based on the story that most of us knew of Philby, Tim Philby. Was George Smiley somebody you knew?
No, he wasn't really. There were kind of 3 sources for George Smiley. The first was my tutor at Oxford, who's still alive, a man called Vivian Green, who was a little mousy-looking guy with a dog collar in those days, and totally inconspicuous and extraordinarily observant and shrewd. And then, when I was the young spook, there was a man I worked with in the same building called John Bingham, also Lord Clanmorris, who was working in British security. And John was a writer as well as being a spook. And John was also a contributor to the image of Smiley, if you like. And then there was myself, in one way or another.
What part of Smiley is you?
I'm still very shy. That's the truth. It's not a false shyness. I'm awkward. I never feel I buy the right clothes. I'm always, I find life embarrassing in many ways, and Smiley does too. I think I'm better at work than at living, which was Smiley's situation.
Yes. Well said.
And I think seeing a lot is very painful, and that was Smiley's misfortune. And
in his own life,
in his own life,
in his own world.
And in the world that he did.
His wife's infidelity and all of that.
That's right, but also in the examination of other people. He had a trained observer's mind, and information about people seemed to come naturally to him. And I guess that most writers feel that they go around the moon a few more times than people who are not so observant. I mean, it is part of the writing condition to watch and record, to prefer to listen, to speak. I think it is. Certainly it was mine from childhood on. You know, I was just born into that kind of guarded, watchful way of looking at the world. And then an absolutely daft thing happens that drives you nuts. There was Maurice Oldfield, Sir Maurice Oldfield, who was head of SIS, the British Secret Service, for a while, who was short, fat, stubby, had spectacles. I didn't meet Maurice until about 3 or 4 books into Smiley. It made no difference. He was simply cast as Smiley by the media, and there was nothing I could do. Exactly the same happened with Marcus Wolf.
Yeah, no, I'm coming to Marcus Wolf, who was the head of East German
agent
and
running.
It was frequently said to be the model for Carlyle.
Yeah, absolute nonsense. I mean, why would you take a handsome, slender, bon vivant,
who is Marcus Wolf?
Who is Marcus Wolf, German origin, all right, he's also Russian educated and so forth, and produce Carlyle out of him. You can't. It was absurd. But whether Wolf propagated that notion when he came west, so to speak, or when the wall came down and Germany was unified, I don't know. But you know, it was bruited about, and he's come up for trial, and it was splashed all over the German newspapers. And finally, I said it was nonsense, and that I had never used Wolf for any purpose. And I named a character Wolf once after my lawnmower. But then, funnily enough, when my masters read the book, they said, "Don't use that."
Your masters meaning
the spooks.
The spooks, right?
Yeah, they said you mustn't use Wolf. Yeah. He's too well known, and it'll look like you're an insider. Yeah. But I didn't. I was just crazy. But those things are quite sweet.
You know, should he go on trial, you think?
No.
He should not be on trial.
Yeah. I don't see how you can make a case for it.
Yeah, that's his point as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think there is anything heroic or sporting in Marcus Wolf. I don't think there's
But
anything admirable.
He's almost become a creature of the media who looks at him that way. Almost.
Yeah, well,
maybe
I
that's
think
because
that's
of the
pity,
contribution you made. Because
maybe,
people make that
yeah,
association
maybe
and somehow have given him these qualities that the East German Secret Service had.
Yeah, I mean, in short, he served a disgusting regime.
Yes.
And I think he must have known how disgusting it was and how little relation it bore to the ideology that he professed. And he did it all at the sharp end. And he did some very unpleasant things. And I think it would be a mistake to admire him. But I think it's also a great mistake to put him on trial.
He, it is said that he agreed to turn over all the agents that he had or knew about. And that offer for some mercy or for some plea bargaining,
yes.
and it was turned down. Now, it may have been turned down because they thought they could figure it out anyway and didn't need it.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that?
I don't. I mean, I'm very skeptical of such rumors. I'm just amazed they're trying to put him on trial, and I also speculate about what else he knows and whether there is a deal to be done. But generally speaking, there is kind of, in the inmost room, where the great secrets are kept, there's rather less to find than you expect.
That's what we fear.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you, go, you mean even if you go into the KGB files and...
Yes, I think there are, I'm quite sure there's a great comedy to be written about the CIA representatives and the SIS representatives and the French representatives who have gone to Moscow and said, for Christ's sake, don't release these and these files. We'll look awful. And I'm sure deals have been done of that sort, where some secrets are simply, they can be shared by all the intelligence services in the world, but they're much too hot for the general public, because they really do undermine the faith that the public is supposed to have in its intelligence services.
Well, there's this story also about you, that in 1980, I don't know, maybe it was 87, your first trip to Russia was 87, right?
Yeah.
Soviet Union? You went in the spring, and then you went back in the fall, and this had to do, I guess you were writing what
the Russia House.
The Russia House at that time. That you were at the ballet or somewhere, and Philby sent word that he wanted to meet you. Kim Philby.
That's right. That's right.
One of the characters Holden and Tinker Tailor modeled after him.
That's right.
He did send word that he wanted to meet you.
Yes. I was asked if I would go and see him. He was by then very sick.
He was a general in the KGB because of what he had done?
He was, whatever rank he had, he was never fully trusted. You can never bring a man in those circumstances and fully trust him, and they didn't, and they say now they didn't.
Didn't trust him because?
Because if you obtain somebody, if he has defected, there is always the possibility that he would redefect. It is rather habit-forming.
Yes.
And
see, that's the problem, I would think, with the secret society. You never, I mean, this comes out in your, you lose your center.
That's right.
And you never know what reality is.
Yeah, and certainly when you're talking of contemplating the possibilities of people's characters, I mean, if I looked at Philby's record and I were his Soviet controller, I would keep him well away from the kitchen.
He would see nothing.
Absolutely nothing. So they said, would I come and see Philby? And he was ill, and he would like to meet me, and he liked my books. Well, so I said to the bearer of this message, Gendrick, I said, look, the ambassador is giving me a party tomorrow night. I cannot be the guest of the Queen's ambassador one night and the Queen's traitor the next night, and I don't want to come. And he said, oh, my friend, it is not like this. You're completely and so on, and it got into a great lather. And I never went. And so he got hold of somebody else, and I think conceivably Philby was going to ask me maybe to write something about him, even to do his autobiography.
How could you have missed that opportunity? I mean, I would have think that the passion... I know you did. I mean, it's clear. You hated him. You hated him because he was a traitor, and he had...
Yes, and he was a murderer, you know. He did betray people who died horribly in consequence of that. And I can't find it in me to forgive him.
And that overwhelmed any interest to find out something he might know that you wanted to know.
I don't think... Yes. I mean, when... the message went back to him, he was later asked whether he had a view as to why I didn't go and see him. And he replied, he knows something about me. And I think what he thought I knew about him was what it was like to have a criminal father. His father was a tyrant and a crook, really, St. John Philby. a really rather awful man. And I think that when you have that childhood, at a certain point you do consider your relationship to society, and you either set about to mess it up or to join it. And I think Philby had a predisposition to undermine the society that he entered. I think he had a real mission of vengeance. And I think the ideology came later as the rationalization of that disposition.
Yeah. Having completed the Smiley trilogy, were you happy with Alex Guinness?
I thought Alec was wonderful, yes. Yeah. He wasn't my Smiley, but I mean, he was Alec's Smiley.
He was Did you dedicate
amazing.
A book to him? One of the...
Yes, I did. Secret Pilgrim.
Yeah, right,
I dedicated to him.
Because why?
Because I love him, really, and he did something. He took the part and made it his own. And
this is in a BBC
and
series.
He lived that life. We did 2 series together. So I had 14 hours of Alec Guinness television, and about 3 years together, really.
Yeah. But was he curious? I mean, you said it was his Smiley, not your Smiley.
Yes.
And did you have any influence to try to?
Well, we spent a lot of time together.
But in the end, he's the artist.
And Alec was, I'd really never met a real spy. I mean, I don't know if we'd I introduced him to Maurice Oldfield. And I used to tease him. He used to ring up. May I speak to Mr. David Cornwall, please? I'd say, hello, Alec, how did you know it was me? He'd say. And it was charming.
That's charming.
And I loved my time with him. And he was just divine to work with. I mean, after I introduced him to Maurice Oldfield, we had this lunch together, and then Maurice went off, and Alex shot out and looked down the road to catch the way he walked, sort of zoological observation, and the way Maurice spun his umbrella. And then he came back, and we sat down. He ordered a couple of brandies, and he said, now look, he said, I've known people who do that when they're talking, and I know people who do that when they're talking. But I'd never known anybody who does. Do you think he's looking for dregs of poison? And it was enchanting watching such an intelligent man restoring the childhood in himself to enter his new state of grace as Smiley. It was just delightful. And the absolute dedication to the part. It was a masterclass working with Alec and working on script with him. I mean, he's as good as any movie director that I've ever worked with, successfully or unsuccessfully. I mean, he could take a scene, detect the energy in it, the life in it. Yeah. He would say, "Oh no, I don't want to say that at all. I know what I shall do there." And you'd strike out Alec's line, and then you'd watch the scene afterwards. And he did with half an eyebrow what you'd done, the whole column of prose. It was just beautiful, beautiful.
When you sat down to write Russia House, the message was?
The message was the knight is dying in his armor, that the Russian menace is over. And it's very hard for us to recognize this. But we've got to enter a new era, however reluctant we are to give up the convenient attitudes of mutual animosity. And also, it was my conviction, now borne out, I think, that we had vastly overestimated the Soviet preparedness and ability to make
money
war.
And all that effort and all that everything.
And failed.
All those lives.
Failed conspicuously on the intelligence front also. And all those lives. And that it really was over. And anybody, I think, any ordinary guy in Russia in '87 could have seen that it was over. It was quite impossible that at the center of such an incompetent state, such an incompetent community, there was an outfit that could produce a real Cadillac. I'm talking about the munitions center. Even if they produced the Cadillac, they couldn't find the spares for it. And they were just pirating the whole of their economy to service this preposterous military machine. And probably it was one of the achievements of US policy to draw them into that situation and precipitate economic ruin. And good luck to us for doing so. I mean, anything that put an end to that frightful time was a wonderful achievement. But it was over, and it seems to have taken the intelligence community another 18 months or 2 years to recognize what I think any simple tourist could have told them.
Yeah. Did you know James Angleton?
No, I never met him.
Did you ever want to? Did you have?
No, I didn't. I mean, I was appalled by by the effect of his investigations upon the American intelligence community and indeed upon other Western intelligence communities around the world.
You think he did a real disservice to the country
I'm
because
afraid
of his
so.
obsessions and his paranoia?
Yes, he wasn't a wicked man, but he was absolutely misguided.
Yeah, he believed there was a mole in the American intelligence, and the term mole you define.
Well, I think it has historical connotations.
Well, way back
but I
in
don't know
1600 or somewhere.
Anyway, thank you. If I've done nothing else, I have restored the common mole to its dignity.
And also, what other terms? Spy who came out of the coal is?
Coming in from the cold, and then babysitters, lamplighters, honey traps, I don't know.
Secret Pilgrim was an effort to do what?
It was a retrospective.
Smiley comes to the United States to... Well, go ahead.
Comes to the United States.
No, I'm sorry, I was thinking...
It was a retrospective of the Cold War. It tried to catch the moment when it was all over. And Smiley, in his lectures to the new recruits, which kind of link the episodes of the novel, Smiley tries to prepare them for the new role that the West will play. I mean, I use the secret world really as a theatre for describing the big world. That's the overt world. That's the way I try and work it. You know, Agatha Christie had her country houses, and I have my secret services.
Yeah. The passion, we talked about, the passion for spying, your own sense of what are the myths about that world, the secret society? Is competency a myth?
Yeah, I think its competence is a myth. It's the notion that secret action can redress the inadequacies of democracy is, in my view, a myth. The notion that if you invest people in secret conditions with power, they will somehow do for you what can't be done by the overt equivalence of that power. I think all of that is nonsense. I detest covert action. I think that the whole game of interfering with the economy and sovereignty of other nations, destabilization and so on, is something that our intelligence services must be weaned away from forever. It doesn't work. Assassination doesn't work. You can never calculate the consequences. I think, generally speaking, we know now, we should know now, that if we had poured those huge sums of money into more humanitarian causes, if we had studied to improve social conditions in countries that were inclining towards communism rather than placing them under frightful economic constraint, if we had really paid to improve the world in overt ways, studied to do so, rather than go into ourselves through secret services, we'd have done a damn sight better.
Yeah, and for those people who say, and how do you draw a roadmap for the use of intelligence in the future?
Right, that is the wonderful question. I mean, it is first of all necessary, I think, to understand that in any decent constitutional society, it is the customers which determine the priorities of the intelligence gathering. That if US policy goes in that direction, then the support in aid of that cause must be delivered by the intelligence service. The intelligence service doesn't write its own ticket. Therefore, what are our priorities? I mean, it's the brush fires. The first thing at the moment, at this very moment, must be the errant weapons that are wandering around the Ukraine, the whole detritus of nuclear confrontation, which is terrifying. We've got to buy it, we've got to find it, we've got to neutralize it. Secondly, I think in conjunction with that, we have got to stop arming the world at random. We have got to identify the no-go areas for arms.
You're speaking to here.
Yes.
Right.
Then I think, I'm afraid, the boring stuff, which really matters, like the survival of the world, has to be addressed by these intelligence finders. Intelligence is just another word for knowledge.
Right, and information.
And information. And we need to know who's lousing up the world by fearful ecological crimes. We need to know, we need to be able to inform my volunteer army, which is going to serve the United Nations, of the trouble spots as they're going to arise. So we want advance information of the brush fires. What we really have to do is harness these wretched services to an energetic, overt policy. And we have to beat them into submission as the servants of democracy and not as the mysterious leaders of our community. They should never be that. They should come cap in hand apologetically to
whom?
To the constitutionally elected leaders who define what they do. We really must not assess our virility as countries by the strength and efficacy of our secret service.
How much of this is a very successful, a much honored and highly praised novelist with acknowledged experience in the Foreign Service and in intelligence, somehow at 60, looking back on what he's been writing about and his life and coming to a kind of reevaluation?
It's a reevaluation, certainly, and I think it's an informed one. I also think that one of the things that has gone wrong, we talked of leadership,
right,
is that we are at the moment guided by people with very little imagination. And it does occur to me from time to time.
In terms of leadership of the Western world,
yes,
you include the United States. And
yeah, I sometimes wonder whether anybody has a vision at all, which goes beyond their own personal political survival.
Who reflects your vision, who is in or out of government? I mean, does anybody write or speak to the things that you think is prophetic and on target?
At the moment, I know of no voice. Yeah. No, I honestly don't. Not in my own country and not in yours. I'm sure there are voices, but they're not heard yet. But they will. They will be. I mean, I'm not a gloom monger in this respect.
No, but you know what you're talking about, and you know the ideas that are
yeah.
resonating within your own.
Yeah, and I think that it really is a useful discussion about who we're going to be.
Yeah.
And
that is not that. It's almost like this country, and I mean, we couldn't even get together on some policy with respect to Bosnia early on.
No, I know,
you know?
And I mean, the United States said with some justification was a European hash, so let them do it. Who can do it in Europe? Right. My country?
No.
We're leaderless. Right. You know, we have no opposition, we have no government that I'm aware of. I mean, Italy, you know, Italy is wallowing in the misery of corruption. Right. Germany, absolutely obsessed by a declining economy. Right. It's just embraced 17 million people it doesn't like. Right. Spain.
France.
France in absolutely in flux.
Right.
Spain, wretched unemployment, frightful.
Socialism under attack.
Socialism under attack,
right.
and no absolute power. And so it goes on. And I'm afraid it's landing more and more in your backyard.
And
the responsibility.
Yeah. David Broder, the great columnist for the Washington Post, wrote a piece saying that he'd been over in Europe, though, and that there was great sort of, at that time, concern about American leadership. Let me move to one last question.
Yeah.
Any regret that you have about the life you have lived and the work you have done and how it's all, I mean, you know, you've come a long way from the son of your father and a mother who wasn't there.
Yeah. There are books that I wish I'd written, and I haven't written. I wish I'd written a bit more. No. I mean, basically, I've been incredibly lucky. I've had a wonderful life. Writing's been very good to me. I can choose a subject which educates me, and I love that. I think I'm terribly lucky.
And how do you feel in command of your powers as a writer?
Well, I know that this is my best time. I mean, I'm pushing 62, so it's not going to be long. But I know I'm best now. I mean, I know that if I want to do something, I can play all the instruments in the orchestra. I mean, whether I make good music is another matter, but I feel I'm completely in charge of my craft.
It's a pleasure to have you here. The night manager, John Le Carré, David Kerwin, thank you for come back anytime. Enjoyed it enormously. Thank you for joining us for this 1-hour conversation. We will see you again next time.